Welcome to the Hunting Beast Podcast, your source for hunting tactics, news, and stories. And now your host, Mario Traficante.
Okay, well, welcome to this week's edition of the Hunting Beast Podcast. This week we've got another well-known member of the Hunting Beast website, Jason Campbell, also known as the Whitetail Assassin. Jason comes to us from Michigan, and he's got a lot of tips and tricks to share with us. He's been pretty successful over the last few years, getting on some bigger, mature whitetail, 4 to 5 year olds, which is kind of not typical of what most people experience in Michigan. So we're excited to have Jason come and talk to us and share some of his stories and some of his tips and tactics. So with that, let's get right into it. How you doing, Jason?
Doing really good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So why don't you give us a little bit of background about how you got into whitetail hunting or hunting in general, and kind of what brought you to where you're at today?
Well, my dad and my grandpa and most of our family were pretty big hunters in Michigan. And ever since I was a little kid, I was always fascinated by him out shooting his bow. And he always took me along on his scouting trips that he would go to. And back then we could bait, so I also helped carry the bait with him, and he would show me like what a buck rub was and what a scrape was and
Sure.
What runs were, and kind of showed me the principles, I guess, of the beginning stages of what to do in hunting, how to set up in a tree, how to play your wind, basically where to expect a deer to come from, and I kind of took off after that. It just kind of lit that fire inside me, and it evolved into what I'm doing now.
Nice. So what would you say, I guess starting out, if you want to go into maybe a couple of the key stories or a couple of the key experiences that started to shape you as a hunter as you got into that time period, maybe when you started hunting on your own, maybe through your high school years or earlier?
Okay. My first real memory that I remember that really transformed me into being more mobile of a hunter and kind of doing it on my own. My grandfather passed away when I was 15, and he was a major part of my dad's life and my life. And my dad felt like he lost a big piece of him, which he did. And he kind of hung up hunting for a couple of years because every time he went to sit in the stand, it just wasn't the same. And I was kind of on my own that year, and I just kind of remember watching these deer keep crossing this specific place from a piece of private that went across to a piece of public. And at that time, I hadn't even shot a deer with my bow at all, so it was something new to me. And I remember just him telling me, when you see something like that, try to remember that's where they're going, and if you see it, several times in a row, do it. Well, we'd been seeing it happen for a lot of times, so I went in that evening and set up on the ground, and on the run that I seen where the deer crossed the road at, and I went back in maybe 100 yards, and the last, 25 minutes or so before daylight, I had a real nice doe step out, and then ended up shooting her at about 30 yards with my bow, and it wasn't the prettiest thing. It hit her right in the neck, and down she went, but it just kind of gave me that confidence that, I could do this. It wasn't superhuman, and that they could be killed. And after that, I started really diving in deeper and deeper, And I wanted to get a buck really bad. The first few years of my bow was mostly does, and my dad started hunting again, and he went on a streak where he killed like 15 bucks in 15 years, like straight. And like around my neck of the woods, that was kind of unheard of. It was, they weren't always big ones, but, they were basket racks and such,
Sure.
but it was still the kind of success you don't see from most people typically around here. And, so then I was asking him, like, what are you doing? I want to know what you're doing, because I keep getting does, but I can't get a buck. And,
Right.
he was like, well, you kind of got to get off the bait pile a little bit and hunt, a little thicker cover. And, they're different than the does are. And so I started kind of listening to what he was saying more and scouting a little more with him, and got off the bait pile. And sure enough, I started seeing more bucks. And at first, with the excitement of never killing a buck, man, I shot every buck that walked by me. It seemed like if it was a legal buck, I was shooting it.
Uh-huh.
And after getting quite a few of those on my own, we started talking in depth about why we can't seem to get on bigger deer, why it is that we can't get, the older ones. And we wondered if it's just because they're not around, or is it something that we're doing? Is it a setup and whatnot? So, and back then, you got to remember, we hunted the same stands very frequently. Even though we had scouted and found good places to hunt, we definitely overhunted our stands. So, we would sit there 4 or 5 days in a row sometimes, thinking that eventually he's going to swoop by. And
Were these stands that you were typically setting up ahead of time?
Oh yeah. They were. We would scout in the summer, and then hang the stands right before season.
Sure.
And maybe 2 weeks before season, we would go in and set up our setups, and then we'd go in and hang our stands the day we were going to hunt. So the first hunt was a fresh one, as far as the stand being hung there. But that we left the stands, and we'd have 8, 9, 10 stands hanging all over the place. And we just kind of, when the wind was right for one, we'd go hunt that one. And it paid off with a lot of 1.5-year-old and even some 2.5-year-old bucks. But we weren't seeing the mature deer like we wanted to.
Right.
So that really kind of drove me and him both to, okay, what are we doing? And we probably watched every hunting video known to man. We read every book we could get our hands on. I think I've read every issue of Peterson's Bow Hunting magazine, or any magazine on the shelf. There was common literature for us to have in the house and all over. And, we got this false sense of security after seeing the videos of, what to do. Here these guys are setting up on crop fields and right off the edge of them and shooting 150-inch deer, and we're not even catching eyes of deer that size. And something wasn't right, and it wasn't adding up. And
so what was the typical, I guess, topography of the piece of property that you guys were hunting at that time?
Well, mainly swamp, oak flats, acorn ridges.
Sure.
Agricultural land. Most of Michigan where we hunt is very flat. So, you have the cattail marshes, some of the swamps, thickets, open woods. But for the most part, it's all ag land. So, most of the food sources that we perceived at the time, like beans and corn and beets, were always on the private side. And that's where we would tend to see most of the deer. When we did see them in daylight, they'd be out in the field. So we were like, okay, well, they got to be bedded somewhere. And so we kind of upped our scouting. And this was pre-beast, before we even knew about the beast. We started scouting, and my dad was like, we need to get in these cattail marshes. Like, that's where I think they're at. They're hiding because of all the pressure that we're seeing around. And it was like, how do you hunt in them? Because there's no trees to hang in.
Right.
And so we hunted the marsh from the outside edges on the transitions with our tree stands that year, and I bought 2 lone wolf stands and sticks, and we bounced around a lot, and our mature buck sightings went up exponentially. But we just couldn't close the distance. It seemed like they were always just too far out of range, or when we would see them, they'd be walking in the middle of the cattail marsh, or we just weren't getting on those deer like we wanted to, but we were still being successful on seeing 2.5 and 1.5 olds, and at that time we were still shooting them.
Right.
And then one year we went in and scouted an area that we were really confident in. We'd seen some good mature bucks in, and I went and hung a stand, played the wind just like I should have, walked in and set my stand up, and about an hour before daylight I had a really nice 8-point come working in and ended up shooting him at about 15 steps. But what I noticed was this deer was probably only a 1.5 old, but he had the genetic, the nice structure on him that what you were looking for. And he was typically bigger than what you would see most 1.5 olds here. He was 14-inch inside spread, had a split tine on him.
Sure.
Really the one you want to pass to allow
Right.
to get bigger. And I shot him. And when I shot him, I was actually videoing him on my phone. I actually hung my bow up, and I just kind of shrugged my shoulders, and I was like, "Whoa, that was fun, that was cool." And as I sat there a little longer, I thought I didn't have that, adrenaline rush of excitement that whole, what I was always had before, and I realized that, like, I should have passed that deer because that really wasn't what I was looking for anymore. And I really did my area more harm than good just now. And then it really got me to thinking, how long have I been doing that, shooting some of these 1.5 olds and 2.5-year-olds? And it was about that time that my dad gave me a call and said, "You got to come check this website out that I found looking for a stool to hunt the marsh in. It's called the Hunting Beast." And so I was like, okay. So I got on there, and it was like the light bulb went off, and it was, wow, there's so many more guys just like me that are in the same position, and then some that are so much more further along in their hunting careers than what I am. And I just dove in, and it changed everything I did from a hunting aspect.
Yeah. So what, once you and your dad made that transition and started hunting closer to those cattail marshes, and what are some of the key things that you took, I guess, in that next season and just implemented right away from what you started to learn?
Well, the first thing was, if you're not close in the last 45 minutes of daylight, you ain't getting a crack.
Yeah.
Like you're just not in the game. And I noticed that they were following the terrain of the land, the way the land laid out, and they were very smart about how they did it. And it seemed like they would stick close to the thick cover.
Sure.
Whether it was red brush that was out there, or dogwood, a line of trees it might be. And we noticed that even if the marsh was wide open and there was maybe 2 or 3 trees that were out in the marsh, that those deer tended to travel towards those areas. They would make their way towards that to the open woods, but they weren't getting there in daylight hours. They would sit and mill around, and it didn't look like they were in any hurry to get out of there.
What so with those thicker areas, I mean, you said you had looked at bedding a little bit in the past, but when did you take you and your dad or yourself take your first trip in the off season into these areas to actually try to locate some bedding?
It was the first year we found the beast, and I had bought a couple of trail cameras the year before, and my dad said, hey, let's let's go look at this one spot that I found late last season and see if we can't do, a little bit of homework in there and find some setups, because it's right in this swamp.
Sure.
And there was some huntable trees that were there, but we were kind of fresh going in there. So we went in the spring and found what we thought were some good areas, and I hung some cameras up and left the cameras, and came back after about a month and pulled the cards, and lo and behold, when we pulled the cards, all of a sudden there's a couple mature bucks on the camera, and him and I are like, whoa, all excited, because you don't see those kind of bucks very often. And what was really the telltale sign was that in one of the locations, 2 of the bucks were bedding down in front of the camera, actually
Really?
coming in the morning and bedding down. And it was like every other day they were there, and consistently. And they would lay from the last hour of dark. They'd come in there, and then I'd see them come back in the morning, and they'd lay there for a few hours, and then they would leave. And so then I started going back and looking at what the wind direction was, and seeing what days that winds were that they were laying there and how they were laying. Well, so when we went in there to pull the card again, about a month later, they were still doing it, but what we noticed were the beds. And it was one of those moments where we were like, these are beds. This whole time we were walking by these and not even paying attention to them, and they were beds. And so that really changed everything. At that moment, it was like, now we know what we're looking for. Like, it's not just here, this is what it should be. It was actual visual proof, hair in the beds, worn down, a primary bedding site. And so we implemented a plan for, opening day to go in there and kill them.
So how did you talked about how you started tracking the wind and the different way that they set up in those beddings. Did you have a variance on what you could do with your access points to get to that area? So how far away did you guys try to set up on those beds in that first year that you monitored? Were you 100 yards away?
Well, the first hunt, I sat up in a tree that my camera was actually placed in the morning.
Okay.
I went in there and sat up in the tree. It was probably 5 yards to 10 yards from where the beds were located. And I figured, because I was getting daylight camera photos of them coming in between 9 and 10 a.m., I figured that if I got in there a couple hours early and waited, that they'd come back through, and on their way back into bed, I would intercept them and hopefully get a shot at one of them. So I would say early on, we were hunting right in the bed, almost, like right on top of them.
Did you have success doing that, or was it more, I guess, now looking back, do you think that was actually more difficult to try to make that work because of getting in there in the morning and potentially bumping other deer out of beds and so forth?
In the morning, the first morning I hunted, the very first morning I hunted it, it was extremely successful. I didn't end up getting a shot, but just like the camera was telling me, they were coming back in, and it worked out. But after that, it changed the complexity as a whole. And every first hunt we hunted like that, if you didn't see them the first time, if you hunted back in there again, it was burned. It was no good. Yeah, we weren't seeing them. Your scent was down. It was basically like you got to move on and try to locate them again. And so I think the first initial stages of it, we pressed a little too hard and got too close, and because of it, ended up blowing out some really good areas.
So, but that's a good point, though. I mean, the progression, if people are trying to understand this, you guys started hunting those transitions, then you located bedding, then you patterned some bucks that were moving in and out of that bedding. and then really on your first sit in those areas is when you had your best action. So yeah, that right there is kind of the essence of what a lot of other people experience when they use those tactics, you know.
Yep. Yeah, we definitely did it. We were on to doing it the right way. We just needed to refine and critique some things, and that's really, to be honest with you, where the Hunting Beast came in and totally paid off in so many ways, because so many of the great hunters on that site had so much insight and were so helpful, and the topics we discussed, that we immediately seen exactly where we could implement those strategies and those tactics to our advantage without giving the buck the advantage.
So another topic that when we talked about this the other day that you wanted to bring up, and maybe this ties into once you started, you know, transitioning into this style, is the use of observation stands in these areas. So when did you start utilizing those, I guess?
I started using observation stands probably about 4 to 5 years ago. And I got the idea off of the Beast, to be honest with you. And there was a thread we had a while back ago, and Dan had talked about it, some other members on there, and it made sense, because really, when I looked at it, the way that we were hunting the first year before we found the Beast and the cattails and setting the trees that was really what we were doing. We just weren't moving in when we saw a pattern, or when we saw that a deer was in the area. We kept hanging back, and we weren't aggressive enough at that point. And so when I started targeting specific bucks in specific areas, I started using observation stands more often. Mm-hmm. And a good buddy of mine, Ridge Runner 7 on the website, him and I talked about this extensively a few years back, and he had kind of told me how he had done the same thing in some areas, and so then I started doing it, and it led to the last 4 or 5 kills that I have, actually.
So when you set up an observation stand, what are you typically looking for people that are new to it? How far, and this may be kind of an obvious question, but how far back do you need to get? Is it further enough back so you're not disrupting the area, but where you can get high enough to sort of see everything around, or how do you adjust, you know, when you get in there?
Well, one of the first things that I do when I'm looking for an observation stand overlooking what I believe to be a primary bedding area or a bed that I'm keying in on is access to the area. Where is there a public trail? Is there maybe a group of hunters that are going through using the same area over and over that's going to be used year in, year out? It could be a crop field that I know that they're not using in daylight hours. It could be a drainage ditch. It could be any type of feature that I know that I'm not going to come into contact with that deer in an area where he's going to realize that I'm onto him.
Got it.
And the distance, you know, this gets talked about a lot on the forum, but there really is no distance away. It could be, you know, some of them I might have are 200 yards away. Some of them I have are 100 yards away from where it's at. But they're in areas where I can see the primary bedding, and I know that the deer aren't going to make it to me or come to and from that direction to when they do go to bed or when they come to exit to bed. So you're looking for a good vantage point and a safe place that deer, when they come into contact with your human scent, aren't going to freak out or bust out of their bedding. It's something that they come across more frequent and they tolerate.
Got it. That makes sense. So, and I don't know if you want to tie this into beginning to talk about a couple of your stories of some of your favorite hunts, but just how you look at a specific area in general. Now that you started putting all these pieces together, how you would break an area down to hunt it based on food, pressure, deer movement, other changes that might affect that area. And then maybe you could dive into some of your hunts that show these examples of how you set up.
Well, one of the things that I do, and I've been doing for several years now, is I write almost everything I see down. I have folders that I keep of every area that I'm hunting broken down, a lot like how you and Dan broke it down in the last video, section to section, bedding area to bedding area, and I also locate the food sources, and it took several seasons to do this, but obviously we know that the corn and the beans and beets or whatever the crop fields are, they will rotate from year to year, and based upon that, some areas are hot one year and some areas aren't hot the next year.
Sure.
Just like with oak trees, we have white oaks and pin oaks a lot that are in our area, and when we have a good acorn drop, certain areas get hot during the year, and when they're bad, they're not as good. So I identified basically everything that was variable in the situation when it comes to wind, where were the thermals going, what food sources were prevalent during the time of the year, what areas that I knew were getting more pressure from other hunters. And then every time I sat a stand, if I seen 7 does and a 1.5-year-old buck, I wrote it down. 7 does, 1.5-year-old buck. They came from this place, moving to this way. The wind was such and such. It was this cold out or hot out, whatever it was. I mean, I really wrote everything I could down.
Sure.
And mapped it out. And it really helped me for the next years being able to predict where I knew the does would be and where I knew the bucks would be. And I could go back through that and flip through and see, I seen a mature buck at this stand and he was at this place, or I had an encounter with one at this place. And it kind of allowed me during the off season and scouting to focus in on the areas that I were seeing the mature bucks in more frequent than I was just does or younger bucks, and I could really dive into it and then tear it all apart and figure out, okay, where are the beds now? Where are they all located at? And then it started, when you do that, you have something in front of you that is a list of things that says, okay, such and such area at such and such time with such and such wind is going to be hot during such and such time. And you knew kind of your odds a little more by doing it that way. And once I started doing that and kept doing that, there were a lot of areas I could throw out because I never seen anything but young bucks and does out of it. So I knew I don't need to waste my time in an area that's not going to hold what I'm looking for.
Right.
And so I started getting a little more pickier and choosier about the areas that I was going to focus in on. You only have so many days to hunt with work and family and kids and other obligations. And I wanted those days to be the best days I possibly could and have the best chance I could.
Yep, that makes sense. And it, as I do a lot of these interviews, that seems like a common theme with the guys that have been very successful year after year, is their collection of the data and the data that you just talked about. I mean, being able to put patterns together. One of the key things I picked up on that you said is that, you'd look back through and focus on those areas where you continuously saw mature deer moving and what the wind was, what the weather was at that time, what time of year that was. and I agree. I think the big advantage there is you can go out and actually find those bedding areas and look at the access trails in relationship to those observations that you made. And then come season time, it's really sort of a pick and choose, sit and wait type scenario where you're waiting for those weather conditions or you're waiting for that specific time of the year, and then you can slide in to increase your odds.
Yep. I mean, that's exactly what we did. I'm an engineer, so excuse me, I'm a little bit of an analytical type as it is already. So
sure,
that was kind of, what I was trying to focus in on. And we also, and I can tell you a lot of guys will go through this. Think about how many times you went into an area and bumped a big buck, and he jumped up and took off running, and you think, oh man, like I kind of, I didn't even know he was there. And we had walked by that several times and not really thought anything of it. And then when I started doing this, I went back to those areas and found those beds again and was like, 2 and 2 is coming together. Like, this makes sense. So then it really helped change a lot of what I was thinking and seeing. And we talk about it all the time on the Beast. 1.5-year-old and 2.5-year-old bucks do not act like mature deer. Does are the same way. It's you're hunting a different breed of animal, and they like to be on their own, and they want to be where there's no or less pressure, and the advantage is always to them. And in every one of those bedding areas that I found, that's exactly what I found. The advantage was always to them in that situation, and they had the drop on me before I even knew that they were there.
Sure. So why don't you dive into maybe one of your stories? I know there was a lot of guys that wanted to hear about your 2015 kill, so maybe you can talk about that, or one of your other hunts that you're particularly fond of.
Okay. I have a couple of them, but I'll start out with the 2015 deer. The area that I killed this deer in is an area that I've been working on with my dad for probably the last 5 or 6 years. And I went in the springtime and did a ton of scouting in this area and actually located a couple of beds. And with the first season that I went in there, and I wasn't sure what time of the year they were or anything. All I knew is there was a bed there, and I never seen a deer in it. Never jumped a deer out of it when I went in there. And this place, some years when we have a heavy rain, it floods out and it will get a lot of water in it. And some years, if it doesn't rain a whole lot, it's dry. On the years that it was dry, we found they were bedding in certain areas that they wouldn't the years it was wet. And
sure.
And this is
a cattail marsh type area?
It is a cattail, red brush, CRP grass. It's a mixture. I mean, it really has everything that a big buck would want and what you're looking for. And it's a big marsh too. It's not small by no means.
Sure.
And so one day it was raining, and I was sitting in my stand, and it was raining, and I decided I wasn't really seeing anything, and that I was going to get down, and I figured it was a free pass to go in and kind of scout those areas, maybe even jump a buck or two out of it, just to kind of learn a little more. And when I was sneaking through, I caught a buck moving, and it was a 3.5-year-old 8-point. Wasn't real big as far as horn wise, but body wise was really big. And I actually watched this deer travel and bed down next to this tree by these group of red brush cattails that were there. And I noticed that he was bedded when the wind was hitting him from his back and he was watching the open area.
Sure.
And so I was like, oh, wow, I actually got to see it firsthand. Like, I'm actually watching this, it was kind of cool. Like, and so then I started thinking, I'm like, how can I kill this deer? Like, he doesn't even know I'm here, and I'm within, I'm not very far away from him as it is, but I want to close the gap if I can. And I figured, what's the worst thing that can happen? I bust him out of there. I learned to buck bed, and at that moment, I was really on high. Like, all right, like I got a piece of the puzzle. And so I took my time and actually went around to where it was almost like a just off wind and snuck to within range of that deer and waited for about 2 hours for that deer to get up. And when he did, I shot him and killed him.
Wow.
And he didn't even make it out of the bed, but maybe a step or two, and had no idea when I
so
shot him.
Were you hunting from the ground all that time, or did you set up your stand again?
I had a stand set up, but I had left my stand because I was just going to do, we
Sure.
call it a skunt, where we're scout hunting and basically walk around, and then I would circle back to get my stand and then head out of there. And so I didn't have a stand on my back at all. I was in the wide open, and I just kind of took my time. I ended up getting really wet that day because I walked through the water on my hands and knees in certain areas to get to where I could get in position of shooting this deer. But that was the initial starting point of the last few kills, and this year's 2015 kill. It kind of started to, all the pieces were falling in together. I just didn't know that they were going to fall like they did, several years down the road.
Sure.
But that particular bed, I wrote down everything, and I knew the time of the year, and it was early season when I shot this deer. And so the next year, guess where I was opening day? I'd snuck around and mapped my entrance out and went into this location and sat up on a tree, exited the bed. The bed was probably 65 yards away from me, and almost like clockwork, the last 45 minutes of daylight, I had a real nice, probably 130 class 8 or 10 point come in, and I just couldn't get a shot. I did no trimming or anything like that because in Michigan you can't cut limbs down or anything. So
right.
He came out. He was 45 yards away from me. I just couldn't get a shot at him, and I had to watch him walk off. And even though I was bummed out, I realized that that's a primary bed. That was a bed that was worth, putting it in. And so I didn't hunt it again that year until the pre-rut, and I saw a lot of younger bucks, but I didn't see anything mature in that area, so I wrote it off for the next season. Well, the next season I went back in there and snuck in to my stand, got up to the tree, and I kind of made an adjustment from the year before, and I pulled my stand off my back and got everything ready to go, and I was quiet and put one stick up, and I had the other one over my shoulder, and I was getting ready to set it up, and I took a look over at the bed, and guess what I seen? A rack sitting in it. And I was like, oh, man, so I immediately was excited, and I was trying to weigh my options, and I'm like, the wind's at my advantage, everything is good. It was a little higher wind that day, so the cattails were swaying, and you could hear them. And I made the conscious decision to sneak up on that bed again and see if I couldn't shoot this buck out of his bed.
Sure.
And so I got down on my stand, left all my stuff there. I actually just slid my coat over top of me and grabbed my bow and started sneaking my way to him. And this was an evening hunt, and it was probably 3 p.m. It doesn't get dark here until almost 9 o'clock or so.
Right.
So I knew I had all the time in the world, and I took my time. I snuck all the way to him. I had my rangefinder out, and every time, I got 40 yards away and I could see him, and I was like, okay, I'm with what I believe is killing range of him. If I could just close 10 more yards, then I'll close 10 more yards. And so 10 more yards, I got up to him, and man, I could push it. Well, I ended up getting 22 yards away from this deer, bedded on the ground in this bed. And I went to pull my iPhone out in my OtterBox because I wanted to actually video it with the guys on the beast and, look, a bedded buck in a primary bed. This is the wind.
Sure.
He's here. I'm here. I knew I wouldn't be able to get the shot on video because I can't hold my phone at the same time of doing it, but I, still wanted to show it and then, at least be able to show what happened afterwards. And I waited for this buck for probably 2 hours while I sat in waist-high water, went to reach back and grab my phone, and when I did, I didn't realize that the OtterBox part was left open and all the water drained in my phone and completely ruined the phone. And so I was like, oh, no. I was not very happy about that, but at the same time, I'm staring at a really good buck right now, waiting for him to get up. So, after waiting on him, I noticed he finally got a little antsy, and he stood up. And when he stood up, I was already at full draw, and I shot him, arrow blew through him, and he just looked around like what just happened, had no clue, and started walking off and then tipped over about 30 yards from his bed. So I was all excited and pumped up and, walked over to him, and I was sitting there looking at him, and my dad was hunting with me, but he was off a ways, and I started looking around in the trees on, where I thought his area was. I was trying to find him. And I thought, I don't want to mess his hunt up. He's still, he's still in the game. There's a lot of other good deer in this area. So I started gutting it out or whatever, and I kind of looked around, and I was like, man, that looks like a buck laying over there. And I was like, no way, with all the noise I just made and everything else, that's not a buck. And so I grabbed my rangefinder and looked, and sure enough, there was another buck bedded about 65 yards away from where I was. The wind was in my favor because it was a just off wind, but he was facing just like the other buck was, looking the other way. And I noticed he was a good solid 10-point frame, maybe 115, 120. And in Michigan, you're allowed 2 bucks. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to try to sneak over to him, which I did. And I got 17 yards away from this buck. And I noticed he had a short face. He was only 2.5 years old. It was probably the hardest pass I ever made on an animal of that caliber because I really didn't have too many, good bucks on the wall at that point, and he wouldn't have been my smallest that was on the wall for sure.
Right.
But I made the decision to pass him, and when he stood up the last 45 minutes of daylight and, I had every opportunity to shoot him, he walked off, and I kind of smiled to myself because I knew in my heart I did the right thing. And I left another buck for the next year, if he makes it through, to go after, and he was going to blow into a really good buck.
Right.
Did not know that this deer was going to end up being my 2015 deer, but just knew that he was there. So the next year, I hunted the same bed and passed about a 100-inch, 110-inch animal come out of it. It was a 3.5-year-old come out of the bed. It wasn't what I was looking for. My dad had he had hunted down the way in the same area, but back where he was before, and actually on his way to a stand, snuck up on a bedded buck, but just couldn't close the distance, but he was a monster. And my dad said, Jay, he's like, I'm telling you, this buck he's got to be 140s, 150s. I mean, I don't even know really to say a score but he was big. And so he kind of told me the characteristics of what this buck looked like, and at the time, the light didn't really pop off in my head, but it was just like, oh, really? Like we found a really good buck. Like, that's awesome. And him and I started talking. Well, that deer became my obsession because you don't really see too many deer in the 150 range in Michigan on public. And I didn't have any on my wall at the time. So it was something I really wanted to pursue. And I went in there, second day of gun season, and it's, a very, very thick area, and I went to where my dad had seen the bed, and on the way to set up to the bed, I caught a real nice 6-point moving that I was going to shoot. He was definitely a 4.5-year-old deer, just didn't have the big rack like you would think, but he had a good rack, just not what you're looking for.
Right.
But when it comes to mature animal, I don't really care at that, at that juncture. I go for the age class. So I'm getting ready to shoot this deer, and I pull him up in the scope, and guess who's bedded behind him? The big boy. And I'm like, oh, crap. So I'm not shooting. I waited there until dark, and that deer got up the last 25 minutes and started working its way to me, and I just ran out of daylight, and he never got any closer than 100 yards from me, but I never had an open shot at him that I felt comfortable taking. Even though I had a gun that was capable of doing so, it just wasn't in the cards. My dad even told me, "Why didn't you take a shot?" And I was like, I just, he's going to be there. Like, he'll make it through. He's made it through. I just have this feeling he's going to be there next year. And I got a really good glimpse of him bedded the whole time. And I told my dad, I said, "Listen, this deer is not a 150. We're talking he's 160s, 170s. Like, I got to see him." And so that was
Was that bed location that you saw him in there, was that this same bed that you had taken the 2 bucks out of prior, or were these were other beds that were kind of in this primary area in general?
It was a different bed, but it was within bow range of all the other beds.
All the other beds, sure.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, Dan had talked here recently a lot about finding an area that has 100 beds in it. And a lot of people look at those and think they're doe beds because they walk up on those purple loosestrife bushes or thickets, and there's a bed at the point and there's a bed at the other side point, and it's almost like a triangle, but those are actually buck beds positioned for the wind. And
Sure.
He'll get up and move from each bed. And so, you know, this area was loaded with beds. It's just you have to hunt it specifically from back to front, so you don't burn your best bed right off the bat, because they might not be in that best bed right off the bat that you thought, you know, last year, October 25th, he was here. Well, he might be at 100 yards away on the first or second. It changes in that area. And so, but this buck was bedded really close. I mean, I probably could have hit a pitching wedge to the bed that he had seen him in before, so I knew he was using these beds.
So when you're sneaking through in a couple of these scenarios, when you got down from your stand, or even as you're accessing, how fast are you moving, and what are you trying to focus on to not spook these deer? Especially with being able to see them in their beds or come across them in these beds. Guys that are, I guess, trying to do this, what are some little tips that you try to do when you're on foot, not to make too much noise or disrupt the area as you're going in?
Well, as you approach the bedding area where you know the beds are and you're getting close, there's no such a thing as going slow enough. I mean, you can walk along at a decent clip until you get to where you know, okay, I'm getting to where I need to slow down and quiet down. And at that point, I usually stop and take a break for a second, let myself cool down. You know, if I got to get a drink or whatever, because I know at the next juncture, I'm not going to be getting in my pack to get a drink, or I'm not going to be, you know, it's basically to the stand until I'm set up. I'm not taking another break as far as where I can kind of relax and be a little more loud than I would be if I was closer. So when I get to where I feel like I'm 200 or 300 yards away from the bed, I go to a snail crawl.
Okay.
I mean, it's literally like I'm trying not to even let the water droplets drip off my boot, or, you know, any sign, a stick break in, anything. If I do mess up, I sit there for 5 or 10 minutes, or sometimes 15 minutes, and wait. And let the woods calm back down again. In both the scenarios where I snuck up on the bed and shot the buck out of the bed, it probably took me at least 2.5 hours to close 70 yards. So, I mean, I was crawling.
Talking slow, yeah.
Yes, like turtle pace. Turtles probably could have went faster to him than what I did. But I mean, you know, he's bedded there, and there's no, you know, he's not going to get up for the most part in the last hour of daylight. So, you know, you've got all the time in the world to get to him now.
Sure.
So we take it down, you know, to as slow as we possibly can, because, you know, if you bust him, it's over.
The game's over. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but that gun season, when that buck walked away from me, and the only thing I could think about was that buck all year, and all winter long. I scouted harder than I've ever scouted before. I really devoted my time and energy to that buck. He was a buck of a lifetime in this area, this state, and I knew no matter what, any other deer that came by me was going to get a pass for the most part for that buck. I mean, he was the one buck I really, really wanted to get, and I didn't want to booger my chances for that year by shooting, maybe a 120-inch buck, but blowing that, the area out. I'd rather just let it walk if I had to and go. And so I really put the time and effort in that spring or that winter. As soon as season was done, I think the first weekend I was out there scouting already and kind of got everything together, found some entrance points that I felt like could help me out a little better. And I went in and sat the first bed opening morning that I had shot the last few deer out of, and every year opening day, this bed is hot. So I sat there and was overlooking the swamp, but I could see the other bedding locations that I thought that deer might be bedded in as well. So it served dual purposes for me. Actually, it was a good observation stand, but it was also the opportunity that if he was in that front bed, I could take him or have a crack at him. And I sat there all opening day, and I seen a few deer move, but nothing. In the last 25 minutes of daylight, a buck come out of the bed that I was hunting, and it wasn't what I was after. He was probably 110 so inch deer, maybe 90 class. I don't really know for sure, but he walked out, and I passed him, walked down around me. Well, as he was coming to me, I was paying attention to the other beds because I knew I wasn't going to shoot this deer.
Right.
And sure enough, my big boy stands up, and I watch him cut across, and I watch him go towards the way. So immediately I was like, next good wind, I'm going in and I'm going to set this other observation stand that I found that overlooks this. And if I see him there again, I'm going to make a move on him.
Right.
So I went to that other observation stand. It was probably 3 days later. I got a good wind to go in there, sat the observation stand. I'm watching that bed. Nothing comes out of that bed. And I'm like, oh, man, I missed my window. Like, really? Well, it's waning daylight, and I look out across the way, and I'm looking at, some of the other beds, because this area that I talk about is probably a 500-yard circle, and they could bed anywhere in this. And there could be 2 or 3 mature bucks at any point in time in this area. And I've seen it the last few years happen in that way. So as I'm looking out, I look over to this one lone tree that I could see, and there's a little, like a transition of cattails to CRP almost, but it's just enough where you could see the difference in height of the grass. And guess who stands up? My buck. I'm like, oh, so he's 150 yards away from me, but he's on the other side basically. And so I'm like, okay, 2 of the same winds, and he's bedded here one day, there the next day. I don't feel comfortable enough to make a move on him yet because I really don't have all the intel I need to. He could be in either one of them. So
right.
I gave it a rest for a couple of weeks actually, but I would go there on days that I would hunt somewhere else or a new spot, and I would check the trails, and I would see the big tracks going in and out of there, so I knew that he was still using the area. I just didn't know which bed. So I went in there again. This was October 24th, and I got up in the stand, in the observation stand, and I was overlooking that same bed that I last saw him out of, and I saw a parade of does that night. It was the 24th of October, so I figured, with the does moving, I probably would have seen a buck or two, even a scrubber, something chasing, nothing. And it just boggled me. I couldn't get it. I said, I had 4 groups of does come by me, and not one buck behind them, not one buck on his feet. I couldn't figure it out. And as it got dark, all of a sudden it made sense because there was a full moon. And the moon was shining so bright that I could see 100 yards in front of me.
Sure.
I mean, if there was a deer standing out there, I could see it. And I was like, this makes sense. Those bucks are not going to move until late tonight. So I need, and I used one of my personal days and called my boss and said, I'm not coming into work tomorrow because I'm going to be in my hunting stand. And so I left my stand in that observation place. I took it down, but I left it down at that spot because I knew I would be going in that same entrance. I was just going to refine my setup. And I set up between that bed and where I seen the does coming back and forth from so I could intercept them in the morning. The next morning I got in there and set my stand up, and just as I thought, all those does started funneling in, except this time they had bucks in tow. And when I say bucks in tow, I think I saw like 10 that morning. And there were some couple scrubbers, and I passed up a 3.5-year-old.
Sure.
And then right at last daylight, I had a bachelor group. This is the 25th of October. I had a bachelor group, 4 bucks. My big boy, another good buck that I didn't know about, and 2 other subordinate bucks that were probably 2.5-year-olds. And I actually got to watch them chase the does around. Now, the older buck, the buck that I was after, he did not chase those does. He did a lip curl, made a scrape on a bush where he didn't actually scrape the ground, but he rubbed his antlers on the bush, and you could tell he was putting his scent on it.
Right.
But he lip curled them, never chased them, let the younger ones chase them. And then I watched them disappear into a bedding place. I knew immediately I had to be back in there that night because that was all what more confirmation do you need to know than that buck is actually bedded at that bed? Like, I knew where they were.
Right, right.
So I went in, never set up on this spot, sat up. All 4 of those bucks came out 2 hours before daylight and snuck behind me and busted me and caught my wind. And I got to admit, I was pretty heartbroken. I was like, oh no, like I didn't set up in the right tree, and they got behind me, and they were within 60 yards of me and busted. And I called another good buddy of mine on the phone, Bucky, and I started, telling him about what was going on. And I said, I feel like I need to go right back in there the next night because I know he's there. He didn't, like, when he busted, it wasn't like he knew what was going on. He stood there smelling the wind for a little bit and then busted out of there. He didn't blow. They just took off and ran. And Bucky said, if I was you, I'd set up in that, move your setup over 50 yards or wherever you got to, and then, set up there. I said, yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. So I went back the next night, used another personal day at work, went in and sat up. And as I get up to the setup, the only tree that's even remotely in a shooting is a dead tree. And there's no cover on it. It's like dead branches all over. I'm looking at myself like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever done before, but I'm going to do this anyways. Like, this tree could fall over.
Right.
Like, I don't know what's going to happen. So I get set up in it, and I pull some milkweed out, and there is a retention pond off to the back side of me, and I had a feeling that the thermals were going to pull to the retention pond at night. And so I dropped the milkweed. I was dropping it about every hour, and sure enough, it was sucking right to, it was blowing over top of it, but then as it got darker, it started sucking down right to it. Well, that was perfect because that was the opposite direction that those bucks were coming from in the first place.
Sure.
And just like I thought, I see 2 bucks come out of that bedding area. Neither one of them came by me, but they were chasing does. And I thought, well, it's starting to get dark. It's either going to happen or it's not. I don't know. And then I look up, and out of the cattails, I see my buck stand up. And he starts making his way to me, and he cuts up in front of me and goes to where the does were standing, and I see him smelling around. And then he turns and starts working his way back to me. And he cut by me, and I passed a 40-yard shot up. I had him broadside at 40 yards. I passed it up, and I watched him go work a scrape up, and I decided, well, I've seen these other bucks in the area. I've seen these does. estrus must be somewhat in the air. So I threw a little grunt with my mouth at him, and I watched his ear flick a little, and he didn't really respond to it. So then I snort-wheezed at him, and he never responded to it at all. Worked the scrape, started working his way kind of away from me, and then did a loop, and I think he was trying to scent, check where that was coming from, but he looped his way around and eventually walked right underneath my stand at 5 yards. And I shot him, and when I shot him, he hit the ground right there and maybe pushed himself 20 feet on his front legs and died right there. And I
Wow.
hung my bow up, and I was like, are you kidding me right now? Like, that was not, and it was really the last 2 years, and even longer than that, the last 5 years of really learning this area. It finally came together on an animal that I knew was there. And I waited for a little bit, and I went down, and I'm sure you did the same thing on the buck, that big 10-point that you in the video.
Yeah.
You really don't know how big those deer are until you walk up and grab their head out of those cattails, and like, oh my Lord.
Yep.
I pulled him out, and he's 21 3/4 inch inside spread on him, and he had 16 scoreable tines. And it was obvious, though, after getting up to him, that he had lost some inches from the hard winter we had the year before. He was missing probably a G5, I guess it would be, on his right side, which was like 6 inches, and he had a G2 that was half the size of the other one, and where he had double brows the year before and they were tall, he actually had still tall brows, but they grew as like sticker points down in his base instead.
Sure.
And he ended up scoring just, he was in the gross 160s, but he ended up scoring after deductions was like 147 or 151. I can't remember now exactly offhand, but I didn't enter him in the books or anything, but I wanted to see if he would score Boone. But it was definitely him. And it was the culmination of knowing them bedding sites, sitting observation stand after observation stand, and not moving until I knew it was the right time, and I knew I had his bed specific, because in those bedding areas where there's 30, 40, 50, 100 beds in, you better know, because you mess up on one of them, you can mess up a lot of them. And it really stressed the importance to me of hunting with a purpose, hunting specific bedding, and the right time, and knowing when it was time to go in.
Well, yeah, and the other thing I think, what I picked up on is when the time is right, you have to get in there and really, if that's your goal, make it happen. I mean, you took those 2 personal days at work, but how often do we see guys, maybe they have an encounter with a mature buck, and they're like, well, I'll get back in there this weekend, or I'll get back in there 2 weeks from now when I planned on taking off. And sometimes
that's too late.
It's too late, right?
Yeah, that's too late. Like you really do have to go in there right away. And one of the things that, and Bucky and I discussed this, was the manner in which that deer busted out of there. He didn't blow. He wasn't stomping around. He caught my wind, and that was it. That was game over. He headed out. He didn't know exactly, he didn't come across my ground scent. He wasn't, like stomping around. He didn't alert the whole woods. He just smelled something he didn't like, knew it was in an area that he shouldn't be smelling it, and vacated.
Sure.
And headed away. And that had a lot to do with me really going back in there that same exact, next day to hunt him again, because if he would have blew, busted and really, I felt like scared him a lot more out of that area, he would have relocated, in my opinion.
Right.
And I think he would have went to another bedding, and then it would have been back to the drawing board again, of sitting observation stands, trying to catch a glimpse of him again, hoping that I could put it together as season's starting to dwindle down.
Yeah, that's pretty cool though. There was a lot of things that came together there, like you said, with learning the area over the last 2 years, utilizing the observation stands. Um, Also, the other thing is, and I think this is important, is getting other kills under your belt, either in that area or in very similar areas, to build confidence so you could work towards the goal of getting that more mature deer. I think some guys often, I don't want to say it's make the mistake, but if they're really pursuing, that one large animal, or maybe they have watched a few too many hunting shows, and the only thing they have in their mind is like a 160, 170, 180 class deer. I think they don't do themselves a favor by taking those opportunities that are in front of them to build confidence and put an animal on the ground and start teaching themselves that if they put some of these pieces together, they can be more and more successful.
Absolutely. I mean, we had a topic not too long ago on the forum that discussed the very thing. I mean, it's a lot easier to pass up an animal when you have a few of them on the wall, and it's a lot easier to hold on for a target buck that's bigger than anything maybe you would see in the area, but still good deer come by you that are good deer, but you're passing them and holding them. I mean, it takes a lot of kills and patience to get to that point, because it's really hard to explain to a guy to pass a 120-inch deer in an area that he's never shot a 120-inch deer, in an area that's holding a 150, and him thinking, what are the odds of me really seeing and killing this 150? Like, it's I'm going to take the bird, in the hand, instead of, taking a guess and saying, okay, I'm going to pass this deer that I've never shot anything like that on my wall and go for something bigger. I mean, that's why it's hard to explain that to a lot of the newer guys that go on the beast, and, they get a big buck on camera, and then I see it in season. They end up taking something smaller than what they were after, but it was the biggest thing that they've had on the wall. And I did it, and I'm sure Dan's done it. I'm sure you've done it. I'm sure every hunter has done the same thing until you start getting a few on the wall. And then when you start getting a few on the wall, you're like, okay, I can pass these deer because I want something bigger and better. You've set your expectations a little higher, and you want to take the best deer your area has to offer. And in the Marsh Bucks video that you guys put out, the one thing that I noticed on there when you were breaking your area down is the first few bucks that you guys took out of that area were probably not the best bucks in that area. They were good bucks, but they weren't like the one you ended up taking. And
Right.
They led to you being able to take a buck like that because you started knowing the area and killing a few of them, good bucks that were there. And it translated into now when you go in there, you know where the big buck is going to be holding up at.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the confidence, and a lot of it is too the timing of the year, right? You can be patient because during certain times, during certain weather conditions in a specific area, that if there is a mature animal in there, it's likely that that mature animal is going to be there during that time, weather conditions, specific area. So it again, when you give yourself multiple places to go hunt, you don't feel like you have to go and pound that spot, and you can be more patient and go into those spots at the opportune time, and be confident that if there is a mature animal living there for that year, you're going to see them. So yeah, it's pretty cool the way it plays out. It makes it a lot of fun, for sure.
Yeah, it's a chess match. I mean, that's the thing. I say it all the time on the Beast. It's the chess match that I love to play, and it's the strategy and planning out and everything that goes into it, and it's enjoying the moment. It's going through, your progression as a hunter. It makes you better because you pay attention to the fine details. I mean, how many guys starting out are really paying attention to dogwood that's getting nibbled on or browsed on, and actually can pay attention to that, know what they're looking for, and can interpret that into, that's what the deer are using. That's what they're eating. They're bedded close by here. And this spot has a woodlot that's adjacent to it, and that woodlot gets tore up with rubs as big as my waist. Every year there's scrapes on the ground, and that's where 99% of the hunters hunt, is that woods, and all of that sign is in the nighttime. None of it is in the daylight.
Sure.
None of those rubs are in the area that I hunt. You can go through this area, and you ain't going to find one single rub on a tree all tore up. You really have to look closer to the red brush and look at where they, because the ground sometimes is saturated and wet. They don't really scrape there, but they use the overhanging licking branches, and they bust off the branches. So for most guys looking for the visual sign of a big scrape or a rub, it's not there. It's in the woods adjacent, and that's where they're getting hung up on. And they're hunting it and hunting it and hunting it. And, yeah, when the rut comes, could a hot doe lead a buck by there, or could a buck maybe work his way through there and you get lucky? Yeah, you could do that. But that's not where they're bedding at, not even close. It's half a mile from, really where them deer are bedding in daylight hours.
Right. Right. The other thing when we talked the other day, you wanted to bring up is that the concept of the amount of time that realistically someone has to put in order to make this progression. I mean, it's not obviously we have the advantage of the hunting beast and learning from the other members on there and what they do that can kind of fast track this, but there's kind of no substitute from getting on the ground and actually walking this stuff out yourself. I mean, on average, how much time would you say you spend in the off season collecting your data, looking and establishing these patterns and things like that?
Hours upon hours, because even if I'm not in the woods, I've got a map in front of me. I'm looking at terrain features, crop rotations, trying to figure out, the next piece of the puzzle. Sometimes I'll pick something up in season that I didn't notice the year before, and I want to get right in there and investigate further. So, I mean, when it comes time to how much time you put in, it really starts to add up a lot. It goes, hundreds of hours of time, and then boots on the ground to confirm what you thought, or maybe to not confirm what you thought, and really start understanding the lay of that land. I mean, you really have to be intimate with that piece or pieces of ground that you're hunting, to the point where I feel confident you could drop me off in there without a flashlight in the middle of the night, and I know where I'm at. I can look at a tree and see a bend in a tree and be like, oh, that's such and such tree. I know where this is at. And I feel like that's where a lot of the new guys come in, and they hear all this information and they're gung-ho, and they go into an area, and in the first season they're expecting these major results, and it can happen. I mean, you can set up and kill a deer your first year using the tactics and everything, but it really does take several seasons of what you see, of scouting, of mapping, critiquing your entrance and your exit routes, critiquing your stand locations, knowing where the food sources are. You're not going to get all of that in 1 year. It's just too much information at once, and a lot of guys get frustrated with that because they think just because the beds are there, they should be able to go up there and set up in the bedding area, and it's just going to happen like that. And a lot of times that's not what happens. And even for me, and I don't consider myself a seasoned bed hunter compared to a lot of the guys that are on the beast, it still is low percentage odds for me to still have that killing crack at an animal that I'm wanting to pursue. I can't even give you a true percentage. It's up the last few years, but still, you know, I might be batting 25%, which means 75% of the time I'm striking out.
Right, and that's a good point to make. I mean, obviously someone listening to the podcast, you know, they might get the perception that, you know, you're having success all the time, you're seeing deer all the time. I mean, maybe you want to talk about some of your key mistakes or key slip-ups that actually you learned from or allowed you to grow and the way that you went about doing things.
One of the the very first things that was the teacher to me was when I got over aggressive and we're hunting literally in the bedding area.
Sure.
Right over top of them almost. And it was frustrating for me because I knew those deer were in the area. I knew that they were using it, but because of my over aggressiveness, I was either blowing them out of there on my way to the stand, because I pressed in too far, or I burned an area up and I really hadn't learned how they really were moving through the area. And that really taught me when to be aggressive and when not to be aggressive. The thermals, until I found the beast, I played the wind, but there is a really big misconception with a lot of guys that if you play the wind and it's blowing in your face, everything is good. And we've all had that opportunity where there's a buck approaching and all of a sudden he stops 50, 60 yards out, nose is in the air, and he backs up and goes right back where he came from. Well, guess what? He caught your thermals.
Right.
And you didn't know it at the time, and you thought, how could that be? The wind's blowing in my face. It's this. The thermals really were probably the number one game changer in being able to get closer to a mature buck, because mature bucks bed to where the thermals are at their advantage. The best bedding is always like that. They're going to use the terrain and the features for their safety. And a lot of times in the cattail beds, if they in marshes, they might not be able to visually see a long ways in front of them, but they're relying off that nose to tell them it's safe to go. And if you don't play the thermals like you're supposed to, it's going to be a long year. And that was probably the biggest thing for me, was I played the wind, but I didn't play the thermals. And then once I got into how the thermals played out, a lot of those same stands that I would hunt the next year, I dropped milkweed, and guess where that thermals were sucking right to? Right where I didn't want them to. And I realized, this is not the bedding. I shouldn't have been hunting it this way. And so I had to, restructure my tactic and go from a different perspective and a different way to get in. And exit entrance trails were huge too. I mean, you really don't want that deer to know that you're ever onto him, that you're ever hunting him. And they know the difference between normal pressure and when somebody's after them. And that those aspects were huge for me in really helping me out to close the gap once I had located them. Observation stands are huge in my hunting technique, just because I want to see visually and know for a fact that them bucks are there where they should be. And I guess really all the tactics get used like they're supposed to, and I don't think there's ever a moment, and even now, where I'm not still learning new ways to improve or something better. We hear guys talk all the time on the threads and give an example, and let those, I'm thankful for those, because a lot of those light bulbs go off in my head and go, you know what, that was the missing piece I needed for this piece.
Right.
And it helps translate into usually a kill.
So this probably is a common topic that comes up, but for you being in Michigan, but how do you handle with the hunting pressure in general. I mean, you've got a large population of hunters, sort of everyone pining for the best spots in those public areas, a lot of people that do hunt in general. How do you combat against that, or try to work it to your favor?
Well, first, I guess I would say that with success brings attention.
Sure.
And there are a lot of guys that know me in the area that I hunt.
Just wait till after this podcast goes up.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to that. But no, it's okay. I've had to deal with it my whole life, but with the pressure aspect. But now, after knocking a few big bucks down, and guys will go so far as sometimes to follow me out while I'm walking, and talking to me. There'll be a group of them talking, and we'll get to a point where like I'm not really close to where I'm hunting at, but I'm like, so where are you guys going? And they're like, where are you going? And I'm like, wherever you're not going. Like, like, you got to tell them, like, and I've had them wait for me up at my car, a lot of times. And, and sometimes you get the guy who I'd say he's a pretty smart hunter. He doesn't have all those other tactics that we discussed in depth on the beast. And he goes in to an area, and without knowing that you're really there set up on him for a reason, he just goes up and sets up, and it can blow a hunt in a hurry. But that's what you got to deal with public land. I mean, you have to deal with, sometimes people are going to move through there. Bird hunters, small game hunters, people, scouting for an area. Some guys just go through and they'll be scouting. Or you got the guy who's scared of the dark and comes out right prime time when you're getting ready to see a deer come in. And
right.
I mean, it happens. I had a situation happen in 2012 where I had a target buck on my radar, and I went in the spring, and there was a ditch line that probably was about a half of a mile long, and it always holds about 6 to 8 inches of water in it. And I knew where the bed was located, and there wasn't really a good entrance and exit out of there without that deer knowing that somebody was coming in that area. So I went in the spring, and I pulled all the dead branches out of the ditch. I cleaned it all up, that whole half a mile. I actually took a garden rake out of there and dredged it all out, so there was nothing in my way. And so I could use that drainage ditch, which was about 6 feet tall, and it would hide pretty much most of me walking down through there. So I could sneak on the bed, because the bed was literally only like 80 yards off from where this drainage was.
Sure.
But if you walked the open woods, you were busted, and he got you. And a few friends of mine that I, didn't tell them the spot, but I told them what I was doing, thought I was nuts, because they're like, why in the world you're going through that much trouble to get into an area? Like, there's got to be a different way. But it really wasn't. Excuse me. It was the only way I could get in there effectively to kill this deer. And so when it came time for the season, the first hunt I pulled up, there was like 6 guys in the parking lot. And there's a trail that's a public trail that everybody walks to get back to the beginning of this area. And they sat there for probably 25 minutes and talking to me and asking me what I'd seen. The guy had seen me from the year before. I pulled a nice one out, and he just happened to be in the parking lot when it got up there. And he was like, yeah, he's telling the guys, this guy here, man, he shoots, some really good deer and blah, blah, blah. And, so then they're like, well, where are you going? And I'm like,
yeah, you're probably like,
yeah. I'm like, oh, thanks a lot, guy. You like put me on the spot there. So then I'm like, I'm telling the guy, I'm like, oh, I'm thinking about going, this way or whatever. Where are you guys going? I'm trying to get he's like, yeah, we're going to go over to this big spot and hunt. And so I had to wait for those guys to leave me. And I actually got in my stand a little later than I'd wanted to, but I waited for them to disappear where I couldn't see them anymore. and I snuck into my stand. I got in there, and my stand was actually the tree that I picked was only 30 yards off from the creek and was probably 50, 60 from this bed. It was not very far away at all, but it's so thick and blowdowns in there. I knew I could slip in there without him getting to me, and I sat my stand up quiet, and I got set up, and the last 15 minutes of daylight, almost where I couldn't see anymore, he came in, and I had someone behind me that was with a video camera that was supposed to be filming me, and in the excitement of it all and seeing the buck that was the biggest buck they'd ever seen, they forgot to hit the record button on the camera, and I ended up zipping him at about 17 yards, and as soon as I hit him, he let out that rah, and it takes the wind out of him, and he ran, and I heard him crash down, and he was over there gurgling, and my buddy was all excited, and I was all excited. Well, we got down, and I walked over to him, and I seen him laying there, and I was all pumped up, and my buddy's like, hey, I want to help you drag him, and I said, no, it's my dad hasn't been hunting in the last couple of years, and one of the things my dad, he hates to love doing this, but he still does it. He wants me to call him when I shoot one to come and get him because he wants to be there. It's a pride thing between him and I. He taught me, and I want him there enjoying that moment with me.
Sure. Because
I don't know how long I got with him. He's got lupus, and it means a lot to me to have him there. And so I got up to the parking lot, and guess who was in the parking lot waiting on me? All those guys.
Well, sure.
You're coming out awfully late. Did you see anything? And I'm like trying to hold my bow, like my quiver, because I got an arrow full of blood. And I'm sitting there yeah, I've seen a little bit. What do you guys see? And the one guy's like, oh, you got a nice bloody arrow there. You need some help? And I'm like, no, I just shot a big doe. I don't need any help. I'm going to go, we're going to put everything back and go get him. And so it was perfect because I kind of could leave them and go get my dad. And my dad and I came back and went and got back and got this buck. And, we celebrated quite a bit. And it was a very enjoyable time. And I showed my dad, the setup because he hadn't even seen it all year. So he got to see the whole spot I cleared out, got to my stand, which I had to hang my stand 30 feet in the air because the thermals in this spot, if I hung 20 feet, or lower, would suck right to him, but if I got up 30 or higher, it would just go right over top of him. And
sure.
So he couldn't get me from that perspective. So my dad's standing under the tree I'm in, and he's like, where's your stand? I'm like, it's right there. You're standing underneath of it. He's looking. He's like, I don't see it. And then he looks all the way up, and he's like, what are you doing up that high? You're going to kill yourself. And I'm like, no. I told him what happened, and he was like, wow, he was really that makes a lot of sense to get that high and for what it was and clearing it out. And once we got the deer out, I had a car at the time, and we were trying to load it on the back of my car. And I don't know if anybody's ever got blood on a car and stepped on it with their boot or whatnot, but it's pretty slippery, and I actually shattered the back window out. I sat right through it and blew it out into a million pieces. And,
really?
It exploded a million pieces of glass everywhere, and my dad looks at me, and he's like, oh, man. And I know in the face of something like this to happen, it's really easy to get mad. I just picked myself up out of there, and I smiled, and I said, look at the thing that we're putting up on top of this truck, on my car right now. Right? I'll worry about that later.
Right.
That's fine. I'm okay with it. But it was that extra effort going to, my stand, dealing with the pressure of how that area gets hunted, how many guys come in there, and how to bypass that, because this ditch line also allowed me to go undetected from them as well, because they couldn't see my boot tracks because the water was, up, 6-8 inches, so you don't really see the boot prints in it, and they couldn't see me sneaking down through there. The only thing they would see was my car in the parking lot, and that was it. And so, it's going that extra mile, taking those extreme tactics and using them to your advantage, and, putting yourself outside of the box, not putting yourself in the box, and taking yourself outside and saying, what I got to do, what it takes to get this animal. Nothing is going to stand in my way when in the hunting woods of doing it. So I need to be smarter than not only the deer, but the guys that are around hunting them too.
Right. And that huge point that I get from that is just the common group of hunters. They're patternable. I mean, a lot of their behavior is you're going to be able to pattern it on these public properties, and it's really about looking at what they're doing and really doing the opposite, or moving away from them and avoiding, the pressure that they're creating, which in turn is going to play into where those more mature animals are bedding or staying.
Well, deer get conditioned to our movements too. I mean, there's areas in which we had a scouting workshop, and several of the Michigan guys got to show up, and it's an area where I've killed a couple of mature deer in Michigan. And there are areas of public access that the deer are used to smelling people there, and they know that they're there. The moment, though, that you step outside of that world in that area, they're gone.
Right.
And they're not waiting, because in Michigan, we have an early doe season and a ewe season that's 2 weeks before our bow season opens up for the rest of us.
Okay.
And because of that, the pressure is already on those deer. And so you got guys scouting, because how many guys, and I was one of them, when I first started hunting, a month or 2 weeks before season, I'm doing all my scouting and effectively pretty much tearing my whole woods up, because all my scents down, all my best areas are no good. And then now you got guys going out there trying to kill a early doe, which it's private land only, but the state side is open to the youth hunters.
Sure.
And so all those deer that you were seeing even up to late September feeding out in the beans, bachelored up, they're not there anymore. They're back in the pressured beds, and they're deeper. And that's why those areas, I don't really scout the areas close to the crop fields as much anymore as I do pressured beds. I would say if I was you would classify me as how I'm a bed hunter. I hunt pressured beds. I don't hunt beds that or bedding areas that are so much seasonal up in the front, because that's where all the other guys are hunting. They're all hunting that sign that they saw from early season or that's getting done at nighttime, and they're like flooding those areas. And those deer just aren't they're not getting there in daylight hours to them. Most of the time, they're not even getting to them till 2 a.m. if they come out that way.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I've seen some of those same examples, and I think the other thing too, you bring up is that a lot of these sits that you make. I mean, when I'm hunting the marshes or the swamps, I mean, there's a lot of times where you don't see deer, especially if you're hunting those pressured beds or those specific areas. Now, if I'm hunting a crop field or a field edge per se, a lot of times I'll see a lot of deer. I'll see a lot of deer traveling to those crop fields. Now, it won't be the deer that I want to see, right? It won't be that mature animal necessarily, but I see a lot of doe, or I'll see a lot of immature bucks that are making their way into those crop fields, and I may see 15, 20 deer in a night. But honestly, over the past... Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Mario. I'd say if you want to harvest a doe over those areas to put meat in the freezer, those are great areas, to go ahead and hunt. But like you said, for a mature buck, it's not there.
Yeah, and people shouldn't get discouraged. I mean, if you're going into a cattail marsh or one of these swamps to hunt, I think it's pretty typical to go in there, and when you're bouncing around to these different bedding areas you've located, you may only see, one deer in 10 sits, or, no deer in 10 sits. But I can tell you, if you get on that right spot and it's the right time, you'll probably see the deer that you want to see. And, depending on your goals, I mean, that's what's really important. You know.
I agree wholeheartedly. I wrote a post a while back ago that said, if you're getting into bed hunting and numbers are what you're wanting to see, this is the wrong style of hunting for you. If you're wanting to target a specific animal or an age class of an animal, and you're okay with sometimes going in and maybe not seeing a single deer at all, and you can be patient enough to know that the scouting that you did and the prep work that you did is going to pay off, all it takes is one time. And that's really, we hunt for that 10 seconds of thrill. That mature buck comes in, reads, he does exactly what you thought he was going to do, and you played it picture perfect and end up taking him. That makes a season. You could sit 30 sits and not see a single deer, and the 31st sit, you're wrapping your tag around the animal that you've been hunting all year, and it's why we get so excited, why that emotion takes over us. You know, I mean, I'll be honest with you, there's been many times I've shed tears because of all the hard work and the prep that took to kill that animal, and it all just culminated down to that one moment, and it's like, you did it, you accomplished it, you know, and then it's just that, I don't know, that passion that drives us.
Yep, and that's where it's kind of like the whole journey of what you learn as you're doing this stuff is really well, like shooting a big buck, don't get me wrong, but the journey and what you go through to get there that's the fun part for me. I'm gonna keep doing it as long as body physically allows me to do it. You know, that's the fun part.
I agree. That's where I'm at. You know, I look at my dad, and life's too short. And if my dad would have known now what he knew in his younger years, I have no doubt in my mind that, you know, he'd be in the same boat right now. And I'm trying to pass that along to my son, who's 10 years old, coming up. And I take every moment I can with him to explain it. I mean, it's pretty sad, I guess. It's kind of funny and ironic, but it's kind of sad. I talk to my 10-year-old son, and he probably knows more about sign and how to read deer behavior than most even adults I come across in the woods. I mean, him and I go scouting, and he's like, "Oh, that's a bed, Dad." And I'm like, "Yup, that is." And he'll pick a hair out of it and be like, "Yup, there's hair in it." And he'll tell me things that when I was his age, I had no clue. He's light years ahead of where I'm at.
Yeah, I mean, I think back a lot too in that same scenario. You know, we had some farmland that was in our family that I hunted a lot, and it's a hill country type area. But for many years, I mean, there wasn't a lot of pressure in that area, and from all the surrounding farms as well. You know, you're probably looking at almost combined, 800-900 acres of farms that is pretty much open woodland area, hill country, and crop fields. But I think back to when I was in middle school and high school and the way that I bow hunted, man, some of the stuff I've learned, it's like if I would have known some of those things back then, probably would have been able to at least see or encounter some pretty special animals, during that time frame, just due to, where the deer population was at and, the amount of mature animals that were running around there. Since then there's been some housing developments that have come up and, changed the dynamics of that area. But yeah, it's interesting.
That's constant though. You're hitting on the change of an area, and that's really why I started documenting everything down like I did, was because areas change from year to year, whether it's disease, the climate. Sometimes we had an issue that happened one year in an area we hunted where they had a really bad, they first seen it as an issue of purple loosestrife, and they let these Asian beetles go that was supposed to eat it down. Well, it took like 90% of the mature buck bedding completely out of an area, and just changed the landscape of everything that we had learned in the last couple of years of it, and just made it completely different. Those bucks weren't bedding there anymore because it was gone.
Sure.
Or crop fields, the state sells off land, or farmers sell off their properties, houses get built up. Things change so drastically that if you're not really out there doing your due diligence and looking over the land, those opportunities will pass you by because you're not on top of it. You're not seeing what needs to happen, and you're not changing effectively with the change. And, I see it all the time. Guys are posting on the Beast about, their same spot that they've hunted, and they're trying to refine an area that it's just no good anymore. Like it maybe in time it might get back there, but you're holding yourself back, and you keep hunting the same old, the same styles and same ways, and you're really not hunting anymore. You're more waiting, and you're sitting a spot hoping that a deer passes through there, not actually hunting them to how they live and how they travel and in their bedroom of where they go. I mean, my dad said this years ago, and it just stuck with me. He said, if you want to see a red Corvette, you can sit down this dirt road and you might see one every 5 years, or you can go sit on I-75 and see 10 in an hour. It's up to you. It's how you want to really do it. And it's those memories now that I'm holding on to, especially with my dad, and knowing that I don't know how many hunting seasons I have left with him. And I commonly am thinking back now, even in my stand, about moments that we had or deer that he was with me when I killed, the conversations that took place on the drags back, because those drags, when you're not coming out till 3 or 4 in the morning, there's a lot of time for conversation between two people to get closer and get to know each other on a man-to-man level, and go as father and son, or friend to friend, or brother to brother. And I value all those conversations and those moments that I had with them. And my greatest moment, I really do, like, I look back at it all the time, was my very first mature buck I ever shot. And you and I talked about this a couple of days ago, but we had scouted this part of land, and my dad had hunted there a few times in his younger years, and then kind of sparsely as he was, going through his hunting progression. And he knew these big bucks were going to be back there based upon what he had saw from years past, but also of reading on the Beast and kind of figuring it out more. And he took me back there to this spot, and it's a huge CRP field, and there's no trees to hunt. I mean, literally there's no trees to hunt at all. And I found a little bit of a rise up. There was like a creek that went through, and there was a little bit of a ledge that lifted up maybe 8 feet. And I sat against the ledge about halfway up and kind of concealed myself with the CRP that was around it. And he walked down maybe 200 yards or so and did the same thing. And my dad's one of those guys that he doesn't grunt unless he feels like it's like throwing the kitchen sink at one. He doesn't want him to know he's there. He's not a rattler. I don't think he's ever snort-wheezed at an animal.
Right.
He's not one of those guys. And it's getting like the last hour of daylight, and all of a sudden I hear like a grunt every 2 seconds, like brat, 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 brat. And I'm thinking, he's got to have a good one by him because he doesn't ever do this. So I'm like kind of like chuckling to myself. I can't see him, but I can hear him. And I don't know it, but there's like 4 or 5 good bucks in this field chasing does around. And I'm sitting off to the other side thinking anytime I'm going to hear his bow go off and I'm going to hear this deer come busting through. And I had seen a couple younger bucks and some does earlier milling through there, and it just probably 5 seconds before then I had a 6-point literally almost stick his nose right in my lap out of the CRP looking, and he was panting from chasing. And so I thought, well, maybe he's, maybe that's what he's seeing. I don't know. And I heard something walking, and I could only see probably 30 yards in front of me where I had like shooting lanes to go. And I seen the back of a deer, and I thought, oh, it's probably that same 6-point. So I grabbed my rangefinder out and I ranged it, and I was like, oh, 30 yards, okay. and it lifted its head up, and immediately I was like, oh, that's not the same deer. That's a shooter. And so I grabbed my bow and locked up, drew on it, and then almost like, I don't know, it was like the perfect moment. He turned and started walking down that creek line and ended up walking like 12 yards in front of me, and I didn't even have to stop him. He stopped perfect, was looking the other way in the field, and I shot him, and he, stoved up like they do when you get a good shot on him. And
Sure.
I watched him fall over about 50 yards over in the CRP, disappeared, and I seen his feet go over. Well, when this happened, I looked down, and my dad stands up, and he's like running at me like full speed, like flying down at me, and he's like, oh my god, you just shot a monster. And he's like, nobody I've ever seen has shot a buck of this caliber. I didn't even know how big it was when I first shot it. I just knew it was a good buck. And I stand up, and I'm like, got my bow in my hand, and I'm like, can you believe that? Like, really? Like, that just happened? And he's like, we start like chest bumping, and we're all like, excited. And he's like, oh, we should let this deer lay. And I'm like, dude, this deer's dead. He toppled over. Like, you seen his feet go over. Like, he's done. Like, I seen where the arrow hit him. He's not making it. He's like, well, what are we gonna do? Because where the creek was actually high. It was like it had rained, and there was probably 6 feet of water inside of it, so it was really deep. And he looks over, and I'm taking off all my clothes and stripping down to my underwear. I'm like, I'm going to get him. So I don't know what you're going to do, but so he strips down, and we're standing in our underwear with no boots on, no shoes, no socks, no nothing, just our underwear in the middle of a field, in the middle of public land, and walking over to this deer, and we're laughing about it because, like, people are probably, if anyone was sitting in a tree stand watching this unfold, they're probably thinking, those two dudes are crazy.
Right.
Like, those guys are nuts. And we walk up on this deer, and it's a 12-point. He was end up scoring low 130s, but my dad and I both originally thought this deer was probably 150 class because neither one of us had ever seen a deer this big on the ground. It was the biggest buck that anyone had thought, any in our group at all. And he and I drugged this deer out. We got my brother, and my brother helped us out. But, I remember getting back to the truck, and him and I are laughing, and we're wet, and, sharing the moment together. And I felt, and I remember telling him, I said, I feel like I've accomplished everything that I've ever set forth. Like, the goal that I set forth to do in hunting was to always kill a big buck. And I felt like I literally looked at him and said, well, what do I do now? Like, I've how could anything ever replace this? I don't see how this could ever be transformed. If I shoot a 1.5-year-old 8-point next year, I know this isn't what I want to do. Like, this isn't me anymore. And I remember him looking at me going, like, hey, calm her down. Like, you just shot a buck of a lifetime on Michigan in public. Like, guys go their whole hunting careers, and you've seen out of 40, 50 guys we know that hunt, none of them had a buck that size on the wall. And he was like, just kind of take a breather and, kind of enjoy the moment because it might never happen again. And that moment actually fueled me to hold out and hold my tags and say, you know what, if I have a tag, I'd rather eat it than shoot something I'm not going to be happy with because that feeling is what I get. And the next year I ended up shooting 2 more. And every year since then, I've shot at least 1 each season. And my dad, he's since changed that view now, and now he's like, okay, maybe it is possible. Maybe it really is possible to do this, and it really opened his eyes as much as it did mine, and it brought into play that, guys always ask all the time, and I think one of the questions that the guys wanted, me to answer on the podcast was, are those animals really there in the public in Michigan? Are you hunting just a really good location that has mature bucks? What do you feel like is the biggest factor in that? And for me, it's putting those boots on the ground. They're there. They're there. But you just have to find the locations and spots because, I've got a couple of one bedding area that I've shot 4 or 5 good ones out of. But if you look at all the rest of the ones I've shot out of bed, they're not even close to the same areas. They're completely different areas that I went through with all my notes that I did before, and found those areas and kept going through and noticing the changes and monitoring the pressure that was getting received in gun season. I drive around in gun season because I'm not really a gun hunter, and I go to the parking lots and talk with some of the guys and look and see what's hanging, and they're, what they've got, what they've seen, and that really tells me of certain areas that I might be targeting if a buck has a chance of making it through. So if I've seen a 2.5 or a 3.5-year-old the year before in that area, and I don't see him hanging, and there's a real good chance he made it through the next year, that might be an area worth me targeting and pursuing for the next year. And
Yep.
that's really, that's where, like you asked me, how much time do you put into it? It's hours. It really is. It's hours upon hours, and it's tactic on tactic, stacking every bit of information that I can into putting myself in a position to wrap a tag around an animal that I'm after.
Yeah, and I think, that's a key thing. Guys coming up and learning this, I think almost anyone could do this. It's really a derivative of what you are willing to learn, open your mind to, and then the amount of time that you want to put towards it and setting your goals. Obviously, there's going to be areas that are better than others, but you can go and seek those unsought after areas or those high pressured areas, and with doing your homework, make them into little gold mines. And I think the other thing too is being flexible, finding multiple areas that you can find and go hunt. You brought up Bucky and some of the other guys that I've interviewed to do this, and they all have multiple spots that they can transition to and spots that they're collecting data on. So they have those options, and they allow themselves those options to move around and try different areas.
Yeah, that's those to me were the real, like, my dad was the teacher and got me started in anything, and he's taught me a ton. But guys like Bucky and Dan and Ridge, and Spizar, and some of those guys who have the success that you see, Joe R.E. is another one. I respect those guys a ton, because the wealth and knowledge that those guys bring and have taught me and really confirmed what I was also thinking in my mind, and with tactics that they use. Like you said, I really do believe the same way. Any hunter can do those tactics if he's willing to put the effort and the time and the perseverance in and dedicate that part of his season to doing what he wants to do. If a 2.5-year-old buck is the best buck your area has to offer and you're knocking those down consistently, I have just as much respect for you as the guy in Iowa who is killing a 5.5-year-old 170 every year. To me, if you're killing the best bucks in your area, year in, year out, you're doing everything you can. Now, if you want to pursue something better, you have to go to other places in more states, and that's something that I'm just starting to get into, is hunting, new states. I'll be in Wisconsin this year. I'll be in Ohio for the second year this year. Going to Missouri with a real good friend of mine, Bayshore Bucks on the Beast, and maybe going to Kentucky for a gun season, their opener weekend. I'm not sure yet, but like those, I'm after something. I want to get a boone.
Sure.
That's my goal is to get a boone and Crockett animal, in my lifetime, and have fun killing ones that aren't on the way, and enjoying it with people and making connections and new friends. And that's really what the Beast has brought to me, and it kind of renewed that passion and fire a little more inside of me, because there's a group of guys together that all love talking, doing, and sharing what they've learned over the years. A guy like Stanley to me is priceless. I mean, he all the years he has and the knowledge and what he's willing to share and that perspective it comes from.
Yep.
It really has changed me as a hunter, and it's not that fallacy that most people in Michigan have gotten caught up on, is that if a buck walks by you, you got to shoot it because that's the only buck you're going to see, when that's really not true.
Yeah, I agree. It's setting your goals and putting in the work. One more thing that you had, another thing you had on your topics here is habitat for mature bucks. So, you have sort of this formula that you look for in Michigan, but now as you start expanding maybe into these other areas, other states, what are your key things that you look for when you're starting to review these properties and these habitats? And how do you sort of determine this is a good property that I want to look at and locate, or instantly kind of look at an area and write it off as something that's doesn't have the potential?
Well, first thing for me is when I go through, I look at the public access to these places. I'm looking for remote areas that are going to be harder to reach. I like to focus on swamps, marshes, thick areas. I'll be hunting some in the rut, so I've also been picking out overlooked funnels, what I figure, and even some that are just stand right out to you if they're in the right location. But I also have been going back and looking at, because it seems to be like in Michigan, we had a CWD scare this year. We had EHD breakout in 2012. You need to know those areas that were affected by that, because you very well could be putting yourself in a position to be hunting an area that has low deer density. If you're looking to be successful, I mean, it's pretty tough. What
Sure.
kind of pressure that was received in the area, when the seasons are, gun season, how long are they, do they have early seasons, do they have youth seasons, but I'm looking for big parcels of public that have water, swamp, the really tough stuff to get to. If it has river access, we have a boat and a motor, so if we have to go in that way, we can. Just the hard to reach places. And a lot of my scouting, like when I went to Ohio last year, I didn't have the time to go down there and put boots on the ground, so I did a lot of my cyber scouting of the area, and then I went down there 2 days before to glass some areas at nighttime to see if I could overlook anything, because it's really a lot of mountains and hill country there. And it led to me, I passed a 120-inch 8-point the first night I was there. But had I not had that knowledge and not had used that, I would have been basically walking into an area blind with luck, instead of actually trying to take all the factors I could. And then, because you can really look at a map and see 90% that's not even worth your time, just
Sure.
by looking at it and seeing that it's not carrying what you need terrain features wise. And you could see on the public access trails, those guys are going to be using those, and they're going to be going in and hunting the outside edges of things. And a lot of times, we talk about transition lines big time, on the beast. And in Michigan, that's where most of the hunters are hunting, is the transition lines. They're walking back or going into the woods, and they're stopping right where the cattails meet, or right where the red brush starts, or wherever else. And those deer, that would be normally bedded on those edges are going back further inside, and those guys are almost scared. You know, it don't matter if there's a little bit of water. They don't want to go back in there. They don't want to go through the hassle of getting wet or you know, and the marsh can scare people sometimes. They get lost. They don't know where they're at. And so I can almost bank on those pieces being heavily pressured, where I'm looking at almost like a second transition to where the woods and the red brush start. Maybe there's another transition between the red brush and the cattails, and that's where I start looking, and that's where I'm finding a lot of my really, really good beds or overlooked clumps of red brush that are in the middle of the cattails that guys will look at from afar and say, yeah, that's probably holding deer, but they won't go in there to go after them or, you know, pursue it even more. And so when I look out of state and some of the areas I'm looking at, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at how are these guys getting in there? If there's a parking lot 200 yards away from a swamp that looks like it's getting a ton of pressure on it, I'll mark it up where I think the bucks might be bedded. But when I go in there, boots on the ground, I'm going to be expecting to see wrappers on the ground, tree stand sign, sawed off branches, you know, that kind of thing. And whenever I see that, you know, I pretty much say, yes, I could spend some time in here and I might be able to pull a good buck off, but my odds are if I keep searching and go farther back, I'm going to find better sign, and I'm going to find the kind of sign that I'm looking for that's conducive to what I'm after. And a lot of times that's exactly what I find. I go along the back side of that where it's a little harder to get to or a lot longer of a walk, and all of a sudden, you know, there it is, exactly where I thought it was going to be. And, you know, we did that in our Michigan workshop. You know, we found some beds, and there were rubs in the beds off a public access trail that goes through there. And Dan and I kind of, you know, were talking back and forth about it. Well, I went back in there after the workshop with my dad and went on the back side of it and found overlooked area that was absolutely shredded. And of a buck that's at least 3.5 years old last year was in there doing it. And probably the buck that we found that left the signpost rub on this big conifer that we've seen, where most guys are going to set up on because they're going to see that big rub and go, oh my gosh, I got to sit here. And that's all nighttime activity. But I think from my perspective, I really feel like I got him narrowed down now. I found his beds. We found an access trail to get in there, you know, and it was all off of looking at how other people see the land. Like you literally got to almost try to remember what it was like, how you hunted it before you knew beast tactics.
Sure.
And that's really what it boils down to. Like, it's good to remember that and say, how would I have hunted this area before I would have hunted the beast? And you can almost implicate rut tactics as opening day tactics for a lot of guys. And based upon that, you can pretty much almost pick them out right then and there. Like, oh, yep, you're going to be here, 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 and here. And this spot over here is going to get, you know, less pressure. You still might get a guy or two there, but a guy or two is a lot different than 25 or 30 guys. It makes a big difference.
Yep, and I think, well, yeah, that's a really good point about the very obvious signs that's close to easy access is probably where you're going to find most hunters, you know, because a lot of people don't like to cross water and they don't like to walk that far. That's what I've found. Yeah.
Well, do you like carrying those deer out of there? I don't. I particularly don't enjoy doing that, but you know, it's still what you do.
Yeah, it's what you do. I mean, right? You know, the 3-hour drag from 2.5 miles back isn't always. It's a fun workout, but it isn't the ideal situation. But yeah, so people can be patterned with that.
Yeah, we call that trudging where we're from, because you're not happy about it, and you probably said 3 or 4 times on the way up there, like, why do I do this? Like, why am I doing this to myself? And then you look back at the buck you're dragging, and you're like, this is exactly why I'm doing it.
Yeah, I think I recall last year when I kept adjusting the straps on the sled when Dan and I were pulling my buck out, and I think he finally looked at me and said, "It's a mature animal. It weighs over 200 pounds. No matter how you adjust those straps, it's not going to get any lighter."
Yeah, and then it hits you for a minute, and you're like, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, you're right.
Like,
Guess you just get back to pulling.
we had a buck one time that I shot back in 2010. This deer was a monster. He had a good rack on him. He was a 10-point, scored 142. But the body on this deer was probably one of the biggest bodied animals I've ever taken, I've ever seen. I can only think of a couple that would have been bigger that I know of. And there was 4 of us that were dragging this deer out. And I can't begin to tell you the tempers that flared. We're dragging this deer out, and the guys bickering back and forth, and
Right.
One guy's moving up to the head to pull, one guy's moving back to the feet to pull, and your side's lighter than mine. And I mean, it was a bear. And at one point we all just kind of stopped, took a break, and started laughing because, I mean, dude, it's a big animal. You're not getting this guy out of here with ease. Like, it's like, oh my God, like, you know, we even used a cart. That was a bad thing. We used a cart, and my cousin was up in the front, and this deer had 4 10-inch tines, and it kept sticking him in the rear, and they're pretty pointy.
Oh, sure.
And, he was so mad. He was just so mad, like, the whole time. He's like, you guys get up here and do this. Like, I want to be in the back now. But it's, you know, like I said, it's a love-hate thing. My dad loves it when I call him up, but, you know, and on the way back there where we're laughing, having a good time, and, you know, it's a lot easier walking when you don't have a bow and your gear on you. But, man, when you get there and the work's got to be done, you're like, oh, man, like you're not looking forward to what it's going to take, and you dream of what it's going to be like to sit down in the seat when he's already loaded and there. You're like, oh, finally, he's done.
Yep. It always makes for good stories. Like Dan called me back once to help him drag out one of his deer on the public, and we had it was like an hour plus drag with the sled, and then we got to a certain point where we could use his cart, and I'll never forget it because we got within where I could visually see where the parking lot was, because we got onto the main trail, and we had to go over one more log with the cart, and we get over this log and the wheel falls off the cart. So literally the last 60 yards we had to drag, just straight up because the cart fell off, the wheel fell off the cart. And I'm like, I was thinking, it's like 2:30 in the morning. I'm thinking, really, the wheel had to fall off right at this point? But yeah, it makes for a good memory.
Well, it's the funniest thing I always have enjoyed about the drags out is some of the best stories have always come when the drag out, or once the deer is killed, you get with your partner or your dad or your brother or whoever it is, and it's deciding how you're going to get the deer out, what we're going to do it this way. I drug one out one time with a garbage can with wheels. We put it in the garbage can and wheeled it out, and I'll tell you, I don't know what I was thinking when I thought that, because it was a bear. It was one of those big, huge ones with the lids on it.
Sure.
It did the job, but I think it was probably harder doing it that way than it was if we just would have drug him out.
Right.
But I was worried about his hide being all tore up from dragging him,
Sure.
And that was kind of one of those things. He was a mounter, so. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the best things that I'm learning and letting myself enjoy now is I don't feel the pressure that I put on myself at the beginning of when I started trying to be a beast hunter or a mature buck hunter. And I'm enjoying the moment more than I am, the inches of the antler.
Sure. So with that, I think one of the last topics you had on here was just what are you looking forward to for the upcoming season, 2016 and 17? What are some of your goals or what you're focusing in on?
Well, my number one goal of this season is to get my dad a mature buck. That is like I don't care if I tag one this year, to be honest with you. If my dad gets a mature buck, that will make my season. I'm getting into the videoing aspect of hunting, and so there's going to be a lot of hunts that I'll probably share with some of the Beast members in time, with my dad in the stand and me probably over his shoulder or maybe set up off in another tree. All my best bedding locations he's going to have first crack at. That's my number one goal this year is I just want to see him kill as many mature bucks as he can before he hangs it up and can't do it no more. I still say it all the time. My dad is probably the best hunter I know. He's done well in Michigan, but he doesn't have too many bucks on the wall that are what we consider to be mature. And so my biggest thing for him this year is I want to see him shoot one. That just puts him in that universal category like I've been fortunate enough to have the last few years. There's one buck in particular that some of the Beast guys are familiar with. I stuck him in the shoulder last year, messed up a shot, and he's going to be 5.5 this year. He was 140s last year. I do believe that he made it through with some of the tracks I've seen in the area when I went in and scouted. Did not find his deadhead or him, and that is the buck that I want my dad to kill so bad. Because I can't imagine what he's going to be this year. I don't know if the injury could have made him, stay the same, maybe smaller, or if he does end up getting bigger. I'm not sure. But that's the number one target bust on the hit list this year. We do have 2 or 3 other ones that I seen last year that I passed up that were 3.5s that should blow into some pretty good ones. And my daughter, she's 13 years old. This year, youth season will be her first youth season. And so she wants to get any deer that she can, whether it's a doe or a buck. The only thing she told me is, I'm not shooting no button bucks, Dad. And I said, that's fine. Like, I'd appreciate you not doing that in the hunting area, but if you wanted to, you could. But she's there. And my son, he's going to take hunter safety this year too. I have some out-of-state hunts that I'm going to, and I think it kind of started off as more of if you think Wisconsin's so easy, come here and hunt it thing on the thread that we had on the Live from Stan. It turned into an offer from a really great guy in Bucky this year, and I'm going to go there and try my luck. I'm not making no promises, but I do. That is probably, from the family getting a deer this year, that's probably my number one goal, is if I can tag a buck in Wisconsin this year. And my out-of-state hunts to just gain the more knowledge for the upcoming season so that I can feel like I'm at where I'm at in my spot in Michigan, where every year I can go in there and have a good crack at something. Really keeping on the beast and helping some of the younger guys and newer guys coming up and along and answering any questions I can. And if I can help in any way, I'm not the best hunter on that website by no means. But when it comes to Michigan and hunting public pressured whitetails, I do have a little bit of knowledge that if I can help in any way, I will. And that's really my main focuses of this coming season and doing.
Nice. Sounds good, man. I wish you the best of luck getting that buck for your dad. That'd be a special moment to share with him.
That'll be my lifetime achievement, to be honest with you. I want to see him shoot a Pope and Young animal. That's really what it boils down to. I talk about it all the time on the Beast, but my dad has given me so much. I mean, he took me when I was 5 years old in his waders fishing, carried me in the swamp when I was with him tagging along, and he always made me a part of his world, and that's where we really connect on. And if I can pay back in any way, shape, or form, this is it for me. I'd say when I was a younger hunter with him, there were times where I was pretty selfish. Probably took the best spots. Probably overhunted the best spots. And as my dad, it might have bothered him, but he still did it because I was his son. And now, I've got the opportunity and chance to pay him back. And hopefully that's going to translate into, seeing a nice kill thread photo this year with me and him in it. That means more to me than anything else. Any of the bucks I got on my wall, and it hasn't even happened yet. And, that's all I'm focused on.
Sure. Good. Well, is there anything else you want to share with the listeners? I mean, we covered a pretty broad range of topics, from sample story hunts, beast style, to setups, to observation stands, hunting pressured property, mistakes made along the way. Anything else you want to cover?
No, I mean, I just want to say I'm really appreciative that you and Dan do this for the Beast and for everybody on there, and your guys' contributions, and the dedication level that it takes to do this is amazing. And I, for one, just want to tell you how much I appreciate it and thank it for doing it. And I hope you guys keep doing it, and I hope we keep getting hunters on the Beast that have something to offer, willing to do it, and share it with all the other guys. And Carol, Dan Jr., the moderators, Dewey and Stanley and Deerslayer, all those guys. A lot of people don't see what goes in the work behind the scenes and what it takes to keep this site going and these podcasts coming. And I just want to extend the most sincere gratitude and admiration I can from you, from me to you. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate those kind words. I mean, like many of us that help out with the site and stuff, it's kind of a labor of love. We all got our day jobs, but this is part of what our passion is, to talk about this stuff. And I know for me personally, like I say this on every single one of these, but I learn something new and I get more insight every time I do one of these, and I get to meet some good people along the way. So it's been a pleasure for me doing it. So yeah, as with all the podcasts, we'll post this out on the site and out on Spreaker. You're more than welcome to ask or give any comments or questions to Jason on the blog, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to answer your questions and discuss any of these tactics or stories that he went over. And with that, thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you on the next one.
Yeah, you too, Mario.
That concludes today's podcast episode. Please go to thehuntingbeast.com to post any discussions, questions, or comments regarding today's podcast episode.